Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In last week's podcast, we dealt with the two instances in which the name Eve appears in the Old Testament, namely in Genesis 3 verse 20 and Genesis 4 verse 1. This week we will deal with the two instances of her name in the New Testament, once in 2 Corinthians 11 verse 3 and once in 1 Timothy 2 verses 11 through 15. The appearance of the name in 2 Corinthians merely alludes to the temptation narrative in Genesis 3. Even though the woman is not named until verse 20 of chapter 3, it was common to think of her as a woman named Eve in the previous references to the woman. In the Pauline letter to the church at Corinth, the apostle mentions, quite cryptically, that Eve was once tempted by the serpent who is described as cunning. That makes good sense, since the serpent in Genesis 3 is described as more subtle, meaning cleverer, than any other creature that God had made. That's in verse 1 of chapter 3. The apostle is worried that the members of the Corinthian church may be just as susceptible as Eve proved to be. More specifically, Paul is concerned that the people in the church may be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. By using Eve as an example, it seems that the apostle sees her as a quintessential illustration of someone who was easily misled by a clever tempter. But the apostle does not elaborate. He does not say why Eve was so gullible. He does not explore her thought processes. He does not speculate about what she was thinking in this decisive encounter with the serpent. Rather, he seems to assume that Eve's giving in to temptation was something of which the Corinthians would have been aware. All Paul had to do was to allude to a well-known biblical passage. This probably suggests that some in the Corinthian church were Jews, and therefore could be expected to be familiar with the garden story. Perhaps some Gentiles would have known about this story, but not to the extent that their Jewish brothers and sisters would have known about it. In any case, in this passage, Paul uses this biblical text as a kind of negative example. He does not want the Corinthians to submit to temptation as Eve had. The reference to Eve in 1 Timothy 2, verses 11 through 15, is more than an allusion. The writer of 2 Timothy goes to great lengths not only to single out Eve as an original sinner, but also to use her as a basis of what he wants to say about women in the church. Of course, there has been a long-standing debate as to whether the Apostle Paul was the author of this material. Some people do not think that it matters, because after all, this pastoral letter was canonized by the Christian community. Others argue, also, that authorship is of little consequence because in the ancient world it was common and widely accepted to attribute sacred writings to other, more famous authors. Plagiarism was not viewed as unethical. More recently, though, it has been argued that pseudonymity was, as a matter of fact, considered deceptive and immoral. Regardless, this text is part of the Christian canon and has to be dealt with in one way or another. Instead of settling this thorny issue of authorship, let's concentrate on what the author had in mind when he used Eve as an example. In this 1 Timothy passage, the author has instructions for men and women. He wants men to pray by lifting up their holy hands and to refrain from anger or quarreling. That admonition seems simple enough, though there is no explanation of how this had become a problem. Then the author turns to women. He has much more to say about women. He expects women to dress modestly and sensibly, specifying that braided hair or expensive jewelry or costly clothes are to be avoided. The author wants women to stand out for their good deeds rather than their appearance. That's in verses 10 and 11 of chapter 2. At this point, we confront one of the most controversial statements in the New Testament. The author says that, quote, "I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over men. Instead, she is to keep silent," end of quote. In his saying that, quote, "I do not permit," end of quote, is he indicating that this is his personal view and should be distinguished from an authoritative word from God? Some interpreters have taken that statement in this manner. Others argue, however, that as a New Testament author, this instruction is timeless and cannot be relegated to an isolated situation. That is, this posture should characterize Christian churches regardless of time or place. Of course, this verse has been famously appealed to, with a couple of others, as a means of preventing women to be ordained to a pastoral or even a teaching office. Others have said that this sentiment cannot and should not be generalized, for the Holy Spirit has used women from time immemorial. Think, for example, of Deborah and Huldah, both of whom were called prophets. Find that out in Judges chapters 4 and 5 or 2 Kings chapters 22 and 23. Women are also expected to learn in silence, whatever that means. Is this admonition reflective of the author's concern that women had been disruptive in settings where instruction was taking place? Is the problem that women were, for example, asking too many questions? Were women making men nervous by being inattentive or speaking out of turn? There's no way to know. Regardless, the passage does not become less controversial as the argument continues. The rationale for wanting women to keep silent and refrain from teaching men is now provided. The author appeals to the fact that Adam was formed first, then Eve, and that Adam was not deceived, whereas Eve was and became a transgressor. This statement has to be unpacked to state the obvious. In terms of the Old Testament passage, there is no indication that the man, he was not yet Adam, was formed first to indicate some kind of superiority. When God made the man to take care of the garden, God made him precisely for that purpose. Only after fashioning the man did God think something was not quite right. God thought the man needed a helper corresponding to him. God addressed this problem first by creating the animal kingdom, which God later realized was insufficient in that no helper corresponding to the man resulted from this second forming. As well, it is important to keep in mind that a helper corresponding to him does not intimate an inferior position or status. The word for helper is even sometimes applied to God, as when, for example, the prophet Samuel refers to God as Ebenezer, that is, the rock of one who helps. That's in 1 Samuel 7. Interestingly, in this particular passage in Genesis 3, God is depicted, as Genesis 2 actually, God is depicted as engaging the created order by using a trial and error process. Once the animals were formed, and once they were named by the man, God decided no helper corresponding to the man was available. That is when God took part of the man and fashioned it into a woman. She became the helper corresponding to the man. She was a full partner, not in the least inferior to the man from whom she was made. The only time hierarchy becomes a factor was after the couple was disobedient, at which point the woman's punishment included, quote, being ruled by your husband, end of quote. That was not good news, but bad news. That is not how God planned for this relationship to go. They were designed originally to be helpers corresponding to each other. The author of 1 Timothy was quite right when he said that Eve, the woman in Genesis 2 or Genesis 3, was a transgressor. But he implies that she bears greater responsibility in that she was deceived while Adam was not. Does Genesis 3 support that assumption? Apparently, the author of the letter takes the view that either the woman was more susceptible to temptation than the man, that she was somehow weaker or more vulnerable. To be sure, in Genesis 3, the woman finally gives in to the serpent's reasoning. But to suggest that the man was somehow not deceived at all seems a stretch. One could easily make a case that the serpent engaged the woman thinking that she was the more formidable person in the garden. After all, she had to be reasoned with, cajoled, tempted, questioned, and the like. The man, on the other hand, who was with her, according to the Hebrew text, something that is often left out of translation, listened to the conversation and ate the fruit without batting an eye. At least the woman had to be talked into eating the forbidden fruit, whereas the man stuffed it into his mouth with no thought whatsoever. Or that seems to be the case. In any case, the suggestion that the woman was deceived but the man was not seems to be an unsupported observation. What comes next in the author's argument is even more puzzling. The NRSV translates this line quite literally, "Yet she will be saved through childbearing." That's in verse 15 of chapter 2 of 1 Timothy. This is a strange argument. How is an act as natural as bearing children supposed to save a woman? Would not such a claim directly contradict Paul's contention throughout his letters that people, whether male or female, are saved not by anything they do, but by grace and by what they believe? Sensing this theological difficulty, one interpreter suggests that the she implicit in this third-person verb, she will be saved, refers to the mother of Jesus. He thus renders the statement in this manner: she will be saved by giving birth to the child. Of course, in this instance, the child refers to Jesus. The interpreter sees this text as the ultimate fulfillment of the so-called proto-evangelium in Genesis 3, when God prophesies that enmity will henceforth exist between the woman's seed and the serpent's seed. This will lead to a situation in which he, the progeny of the woman, will bruise your head, referring to the serpent, while he, the progeny of the serpent, will bruise his heel, referring to humanity, or, more specifically, Jesus. The standard Christian understanding of this text is that it prophesies that Christ, the seed of Mary, will destroy Satan, subsequently identified with the serpent. That interpretation has its own difficulties in my judgment, but even if one were to accept it, The difficulty found in 1 Timothy 2 is not automatically solved. If the she who is to be saved by bearing the child refers to Jesus the Christ, what follows is exceedingly odd. This is because, according to the logic of the author of 1 Timothy, she will be saved by bearing this child if, quote, they continue in faith and love and holiness with modesty, end of quote. The plural verb indicates that the author is referring to women in general, they, rather than one woman in particular. Plus, why would Mary, the mother of Jesus, be admonished to continue in faith, love, holiness, and modesty when, according to the nativity stories in Matthew and Luke, Mary had already been selected as Jesus' mother? Suggesting that this text refers to a single woman rather than women in general violates the plain sense of the text. Also, it needs to be kept in mind that in the Greek text the plural is used if they continue. Perhaps the idea that women will be saved through childbearing is a way of arguing that the extreme asceticism practiced by some early churches was to be challenged. That is, natural biological processes should not be abandoned because of the strong belief that an apocalyptic age was about to end. Who knows? At least churches need to be circumspect in using such an ambiguous text to establish either doctrine or rules about female behavior. Without that circumspection, churches demonstrate what harm follows from regarding the Bible as a simple rule book without remainder. Let me encourage you to go to my website, faspina.com, and let me know what your email is so I have a way to communicate with you when the time is right. If you have a question you'd like me to address in a Q&A session, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. One, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. Two, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.